Well, they're really human rights arguments, Beverley. You know, they relate to the issue of this being a political charge, that the right to freedom of the press, the right to freedom of speech, these are all offended by this particular matter and the way in which Julian Assange is being treated. There are also a range of health issues and the way in which the US justice system tends to ill-treat people, as it were, particularly in their prison system.
Yeah. So it's interesting that ill health could be a factor. Do you know what Julian's state of health actually is at this point?
Well, as his wife Stella keeps saying, he continues to decline. And the longer he stays in prison, as his brother Gabriel Shipton has said, you know, if he goes to the United States, he could die. And that's no exaggeration. There's been demonstrable evidence of that presented at hearings in the past.
The US in the previous appeal said that they would ensure he would be treated properly in prison. Can the US not be trusted?
Well, I think history tells us that the US justice system, and particularly the prison system, is brutal. And there's been enormous amounts of ill treatment of those who go into that system charged with these types of offences. So those assurances are simply assurances. They don't have the force of law. They're not enforceable as a matter of law, and they simply have to be taken at face value. And as I say, history tells us, Beverley, that that's a very dangerous thing to do.
Yeah. What are we likely to hear from the UK government's point of view with regard to this?
Well, the US government is presenting the case, but the UK government's attitude to this case has, of course, been that it's not a matter for the UK, that James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, if there is a decision either to reject his right to appeal or he lost a substantive appeal, that he would have very few options. But we've been urging the UK to get involved. Pleasingly, earlier this year, of course, Stephen Smith, the Australian, or in fact last year, Stephen Smith, the Australian High Commissioner, went to see Julian. That's the first senior diplomatic presence that has visited him. And we've been certainly saying that the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, needs to get involved with his UK counterparts, because what you've got here are the three AUKUS members. And this is an issue that it's not directly about AUKUS, but it is about the strong alliances between the three countries.
Yeah, and it was interesting that last week the government supported a motion brought before the Parliament to see him released and returned to Australia as a priority.
Well, and that was 2/3. I mean, that vote was 86 to 42. And if you looked at the fact that, you know, coalition members voted no, but if you looked at the comments from Dan Tehan, what he was saying was that they didn't essentially like the wording of the motion, but they wanted to see the matter resolved quickly. So, you know, what the United States and the UK need to understand, and no doubt they do understand, is that this is a matter that has strong bipartisan support, including, as you say, from the Prime Minister and his cabinet. And it reflects the views of the vast majority of Australians.
Yeah. You know, the Australian government has made representation to the US government. So far, it does not seem willing to countenance letting these charges drop. Is there more work that the Australian government can do diplomatically with the US? Well,
I mean, certainly. I mean, if you look at the David Hicks case that you would no doubt remember well, Bev, you know, that was a case where, of course, John Howard had to do a lot of work with Alexander Downer in order to convince the Americans and the Bush administration to allow David Hicks to come home. And certainly we've welcomed Anthony Albanese's efforts, but they need to be stronger and they need to be resolute and they need to be saying, you know, this goes to the heart of the alliance between the Australians and the Americans.
Yeah. If this particular case does not succeed, how quickly could he be in the United States?
Well, very quickly. I mean, there is, if he doesn't get leave to appeal, and his lawyers would go into the European court system, but the United Kingdom might very well say, well, look, within hours of the decision, we're going to put you on a plane and we're going to send you to the United States, which wouldn't allow time for some form of injunctive relief or a stay of proceedings in the European Court.
Yeah, and the European Court of Human Rights is probably a difficult one to try and convince them to take this case on.
Well, maybe not, because the sorts of issues in this case really go to the heart of European human rights law. So I think the view amongst London colleagues is that the European Court of Human Rights might take it up. The problem with the European Court of Human Rights is, as I'm advised, is that cases take a good deal of time to come before the court because there are so many of them and there's a backlog. But the real issue would be whether the UK waits for the European Court of Human Rights or simply puts him on a plane, with, as I say, within hours of leave being refused. But we hope, of course, that he does get leave and then gets a substantive appeal.
Yes, and of course, because if he went to the US, then he would be out of the jurisdiction of the European courts, right?
Correct. And he would then be subject to processes in the United States and court processes in the United States.
It's interesting, you know, when you look at, say, for example, a Chelsea Manning who was jailed and was subsequently pardoned and released. Do you think in some ways, perhaps if Julian had gone back to the US much sooner, this might all be over for him by now?
Well, I think the difference between Chelsea Manning and Julian is that you've had, and we now know, in fact, a well-orchestrated plan by members of the CIA to kill him. I mean, that was, of course, reported by Yahoo News and then widely reported. You've had, you know, members of the Congress in the United States saying something similar. So he would have been crazy to go to the United States because his safety could not be guaranteed. And in that sense, he was in a different position.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we'll watch with interest. Greg, appreciate you joining us and let's hope this is resolved very, very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Bev.